Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Just weeks from now, voters will cast the first ballots in, believe it or not, the 2024 primary presidential elections. In less than a year, the whole country will vote again, not only on who will be the next president of these United States, but most likely on whether to continue the American democratic experiment, at least in its current form. This coming year will also bring at least one trial of the Republican frontrunner and former President Donald Trump, the most important of the 91 felony charges against him, the federal elections case, which is now set to go before a judge in March. And that case serves as a crucial reminder of just how serious the man was about overturning American democracy on January 6th, how close he came to succeeding, and how much he wants to do it again. And today, we've got new information about the attempted coup. Now, on its own, this detail, which I'm about to relay to you, it might seem small or insignificant, but it actually sheds dramatic light on one of the most enduring mysteries from January 6th and the run-up to it. But more importantly, it suggests how prepared the entirety of the Republican Party might have been to go along with Trump's plot if things went in that direction. Now, as part of the investigation into the attempt to overturn the 2020 election, special counsel Jack Smith has been speaking with key players as they prepare their case in court, and that includes former Vice President Mike Pence. Pence, of course, famously eschewing talking to the January 6th committee. He's been talking to Smith. And according to a new ABC News report, Smith's team has pressed Pence on all sorts of questions, even something so granular as the placement of a comma in his book. When recounting a phone call with Trump on Christmas Day 2020, Pence wrote in his book that he told Trump, and I quote, "You know, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome of the election on January 6th. But Pence allegedly told Smith's investigators that comma should have never been placed there. He actually meant to write that he admonished Trump, "You know I don't have the authority to change the outcome," suggesting Trump was well aware of the limitations of Pence's authority. The special counsel's investigators also pressed Pence on personal notes he took after meetings with Trump. One of those notes, written several days before Pence was due to preside over the certification of the electoral votes in Congress on January 6th, reveals that Pence momentarily decided that he would skip the proceedings on January 6th, where he was going to preside, altogether. These are notes after meetings with Trump, all right? The then vice president wrote, quote, "Not feeling like I should attend electoral count. Too many questions, too many doubts, too hurtful to my friend. Therefore, I'm not going to participate in certification of election." Now, Mike Pence, I think, is smart enough to know that Donald Trump is not his friend. And again, to his credit, he did, of course, decide in the end to show up and fulfill his constitutional obligation. But those notes indicated there was at least a moment when he was planning to not show up. The reason this is such an arresting detail there in black and white, apparently, reportedly, in the notes from Pence himself that the investigators saw, the reason it's such an arresting detail is because it connects to an unexplained mystery of what the man underneath him in the chain of command, the president pro tempore, knew ahead of January 6th. Okay? At the time, Republican Chuck Grassley of Iowa, that man you see there, was the second highest ranking official in the Senate after Vice President Mike Pence. He was next in line to preside over that crucial gathering on January 6th for the certification of electoral votes if Pence was not there. And the day before, seemingly kind of out of nowhere, on January 5th, Senator Grassley told reporters that that is exactly what was going to happen. I quote him here. "If the vice president isn't there and we don't expect him to be there, I will be presiding over the Senate." I remember when he said that on January 5th. A lot of people were surprised. It raised a lot of red flags. I mean, there were already concerns swirling about members of Congress objecting to the electoral vote in both houses. There was a bunch of House members and senators. And then what Mike Pence would do with those objections and whether he would help execute the coup or stand against it. When Chuck Grassley said that to reporters on January 5th, it made it sound like Mike Pence had decided that he would not participate at all, that he would not stand in the way of the coup going forward. He would step aside and let Chuck Grassley, an ardent defender of Trump, play that role. Obviously, that was an alarming and damning proposition. Now, Grassley's team quickly walked that back, calling it a misinterpretation. They said they were talking about some other portion of the proceedings and saying the Vice President Pence was expected to preside the next day. So, again, a weird little footnote in this entire drama. Grassley's initial statement just left hanging there. Tantalizing question. Did he misspeak, like they said? Or was there some plan in place behind the scenes in which Pence decided at some point that he was going to sidestep his duty and let someone else preside over January 6th, presumably someone who would go along with the coup? And did someone inform Chuck Grassley about Mike Pence making such a decision that he was not going to be there? And for nearly 3 years, we've had no concrete evidence supporting that damning possibility. But now we do from Mike Pence himself. I mean, his own contemporaneous notes obtained by Special Counsel Jack Smith and his testimony to Smith's team prove Pence had decided to leave the certification of the votes in Grassley's hands on January 6th. And those notes are evidence suggesting that Grassley may very well not have been mistaken. Instead, he was telling the honest truth about what he knew, that he had been briefed or told about this decision. Again, we still don't know definitively. There's no, actual smoking gun here. What we do now know definitively, and this is from the January 6th committee, is that Trump's own coup lawyers wrote out memos imagining a scenario in which Grassley presided. We know that. We know that Pence himself came to a decision, apparently after a meeting with Trump, that he would recuse himself and allow Grassley to do it and memorialize that in notes. And we have Grassley telling reporters that Pence wasn't going to be there and he was planning on presiding. I mean, Grassley still denies he had any idea whatsoever any of the machinations. And yes, this is about a detail about something that happened or nearly happened nearly 3 years ago. It didn't end up happening. But it's so relevant and important in this moment as we look ahead. Again, focus here as we come down the barrel this year. Because it reveals a key lesson from the Trump era. Chuck Grassley is part of the establishment. He's not one of the colorful pro-coup characters like Rudy Giuliani or Sidney Powell or the Overstock guy. He did not vote to overturn the election on that fateful day when, after the violent mob sicked the Capitol, they all came back into the chamber and had to vote about whether they're going to go along with the mob. He didn't vote for it. In the end, though, Chuck Grassley and the rest of the Republican establishment will go along with just about anything if they see the wind is blowing that way. I mean, no one has stated that more clearly than Grassley himself, saying it straight up, explaining why he accepted Donald Trump's endorsement in October of 2021, after the coup.
I was born at night, but not last night. So if I didn't accept the endorsement of a person that's got 91% of the Republican voters in Iowa, I wouldn't be too smart. I'm smart enough to accept that endorsement.
Truly one of the most almost comically honest statements I've heard from a politician. He doesn't say, I like the guy. I think the guy is good. I think that the guy's coup attempt, good, bad, whatever. Doesn't matter. Politically, I will accept his endorsement. That's it. That's the logic. We've seen Republicans do this over and over again. After he sicked the mob in the Capitol, they've remained in line. That same Chuck Grassley logic. 3 weeks after January 6th, Kevin McCarthy went to visit Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, smiling and shaking hands. Remember, for that infamous photo. And in her new book, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney reveals, McCarthy tried to explain that away, claiming that Trump's staff was, quote, really worried about the former president. And I quote here again, Trump's not eating, so they asked me to come see him. He's really depressed. The reality, as we have learned, is that Kevin McCarthy and Chuck Grassley and basically the entire rest of them, with the exception of a few, maybe Mitt Romney, they're just going to follow Donald Trump to the ends of the earth or the ends of American democracy if it helps their chances for power. That's it. They're not saving us. They're not the guardrail. They weren't going to stand in his way last time, I don't think. They're not going to stand in his way the next time. Keep that in mind. Because it's the most destructive and dangerous legacy of Donald Trump and his coup. It's why the stakes of this next year are so very high.